are listening to the Narrated, Not the Popular Opinion with the one and only Gray. Greetings, opinion nerds. It is I, the one they call Gray, and if you're like me, you like knowing how the rules of storytelling work even when they don't make any sense. Well, put on your best schoolgirl skirt and dust off your katanas, because today we're going to be examining the mechanics of the fantasy in 2011 SuckerPunch, coming up right now. Never forget, opinion nerds, there's more than one way to be free. SuckerPunch, director Zack Snyder's 2011 fantasy film, is subject to polarizing conversation with there seeming to be no fertile soil between camps. Those that love it absolutely love it, and those that loathe it, well, you get the point. Chief among those who were displeased with the film were audience members for whom the depiction of the characters and their situation was, to say the least, uncomfortable. The image of what was being called scantily clad fembots parading around a, quote, rapey environment, itself a construct meant as an escape from an even bleaker and more dangerous setting, could not be squared with the lead character's continuous forays into a fantasy world of monsters and gun-toting mayhem. There just didn't seem to be any way to resolve the idea of a young woman attempting to empower herself to escape one tragic scenario by diving face first into a worse one, only to then inception herself into one that just flat out doesn't make any sense. However, I believe there's a fundamental misunderstanding both of the fine line that separates film art from film entertainment as an intent, and more presciently, how the specific mechanics of this film's storytelling operate. I believe there are some ill-fitting assumptions being made in regards to the relationship between the different layers of supposed reality in the movie, as well as what it is the bulk of the film is meant to convey, and those assumptions are leading to bad analysis, as they often do. I too have been guilty of these assumptions, which is why I'm greatly pleased to take the opportunity to revisit them with a more detailed eye. After all, you can't come to an understanding of what a movie means if you don't have a firm grasp on what it says. And what this film says is not as simple as it might appear because of the film's heavy use of metaphor. To be clear, I am in no way attempting to tell anyone whether or not how they see the film is right or wrong, or to invalidate anyone's personal opinion or analysis. What I'm presenting is based on a series of observations I've made, and all I can do is pledge that I've done my best to be as accurate with my examination of the film's storytelling as I can be. As always, I reserve the right to be wrong. And just so you know, there will be spoilers. I cannot imagine why you'd be looking into an analysis of a film you haven't yet seen, but don't jump down my throat for giving anything away. For this piece, we'll be examining the extended cut of the film as, despite it not being a full director's cut, it is closer to what director Zack Snyder intended and does include storytelling that isn't present in the theatrical release. Just as a reminder, let's do a quick rundown of the plot. In the mid-1960s, a 20-year-old woman is forced into a mental asylum by her evil stepfather after the death of her mother and the accidental shooting of her younger sister. The stepfather makes a deal with the hospital's chief orderly to have the girl lobotomized and locked away so he can inherit the mother's riches. Just before the hammer strikes the orbital class, the world changes to that of a seedy club, where captive women dance and screw for the benefit of the club's owner, Blue Jones. The previously unnamed young woman, now called Baby Doll, plots to escape and discovers that by channeling her will to be free while she dances, men become transfixed on her, allowing her compatriots time to gather the tools they need to bust free. Things go south and Baby Doll sacrifices herself to allow the last girl to slip away, resigning herself to her fate. And just like that, we're snapped back to the world before the changeover, where the dastardly orderly and the stepfather are sure to get their comeuppance. Oh yeah, and there's giant samurai, Nazis, orcs, dragons, and killer robots. The film's plot is built on the existence of three layers, or worlds, or realities, whatever you want to call them. What we presume is the real world of the asylum, the world of the club, and the world in the dance. The common approach to evaluating the film's structure has been to try and draw a direct line connecting the three worlds intertextually. It makes the assumption that the character we follow into the film, we'll just call her Baby Doll as she has no other name, consciously transports us from the asylum into the club and finally into the dance world based on two pieces of information. First, she is the character we follow into the film, so it stands to reason that we would believe we are sharing her specific experience. Second is the monologue given by, at the time, the asylum's therapist, Dr. Gorski, about the creation of inner worlds as safe havens, spaces we control where we can let go of our traumas. There is a specific focus on the Baby Doll character as Dr. Gorski narrates, and a focus placed on the connection between the reel-to-reel tape player, the music, and the idea of the creation of these altered reality spaces. However, I believe the doctor's words are meant to inform the conclusion Baby Doll makes in regards to how her story ends more than I believe it is meant to teach her about transitioning realities. The rest of it provides a different function altogether. The gist of the assumption is that just before the critical moment of impact, Baby Doll is moved to create a world in her mind, like Dr. Gorski says, with the implication that it will allow her an escape. However, there are several pieces of storytelling that have to be taken into account before settling on that assumption. This changeover doesn't happen until just before the orbiter class enters Baby Doll's eye socket. The surgeon wasn't set to arrive until 5 days after Baby Doll was interned, but we virtually fast forward to the procedure being performed. As far as the progression of storytelling goes, it's a little bit late to show the character building a fantasy to escape to. Baby Doll doesn't escape to a world of freedom. The club is just as bad, if not worse, than the asylum. It's another place you escape from, just as the storytelling showcases. There is nothing indicating that Baby Doll has instigated this shift in reality. It just happens in between frames. Baby Doll displays no awareness of the asylum world apart from a vague reference to an act she wishes she could take back, which we interpret as the asylum character's accidental shooting of her younger sister. Neither Baby Doll's condition or situation has changed in terms of how it fits in context. She's still incarcerated against her will and still has a 5-day ticking clock before her, after which her life as she knows it will come to an end. We have no way of knowing if anything that happens at the club will affect the asylum, as they aren't presented as being linked in any way, meaning the best outcome we could hope for Baby Doll is that an outside agent arrives to stop the doctor from finishing the procedure. But if that happens, then what would have been the point of the fantasy? So one of two things must be the case. Either the storytellers have a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means for a character to escape into a fantasy, or that isn't what's happening. I know this strikes at the heart of the long-held beliefs about how the movie is supposed to function, but given the above statements, it's my belief that changing over the film from the asylum to the club is not about the character of Baby Doll shifting from one reality into another, but the presentation of the story being reconfigured so it can be told a different way. At the point of changeover, the story has rewound itself, resetting Baby Doll's introduction and wiping away anything that came before it, along with Baby Doll's awareness of those events or that reality. This new storytelling isn't being presented as a place of fantasy created by a specific character in line with Dr. Gorski's counsel on creating a world you control. As far as we know, the events in the club aren't running in parallel with the events of the asylum, as, unlike the club and the dance sections, we don't move back and forth between the two of them to chart that progress. The club storytelling covers events we haven't been presented with in the asylum, taking place within the 5 days the previous storytelling skipped over. For all intents and purposes, following the changeover, this is a new presentation of the same basic story. The storytelling is being altered, but there's nothing to indicate that it's Baby Doll initiating this alteration, much less doing it for any specific purpose, especially considering that she doesn't seem to be in control of the fantasy and doesn't have any choice in returning from it. In fact, if anything, the film gives the appearance that the events in the asylum were a performance being rehearsed in the club. If followed logically, that would make the club the real world, which doesn't track for a number of reasons, including the fact that the asylum storytelling continues after the club storytelling has concluded. So what I believe we have is the film and the filmmakers taking the liberty to reconfigure the elements of the film in order to approach the story a different way, as if they had two different ideas for how to tell the story and decided on a method that allowed them to do both. Normally, a film wouldn't allow for such a radical change to the foundation of its world without some kind of storytelling to indicate it's possible, which is why I believe Dr. Gorski's statement about creating worlds holds so much sway over the common perception. However, there is a key flaw in that approach. This, let's call it a permission to change, is usually predicated on the presumption of an accepted base reality, a place to start from that provides the contrast or comparison to the transformed state and serves as a touchstone for the storytelling. It's typically presented as a place the character realizes they have to return to in order to resolve their real issue, or they consciously realize they must escape from, metaphorically examined within the fantasy. Like the presentation of a dream or a memory, they gain their narrative weight as they act in support of or in contrast to the presumed reality. Unless the change is being done simply for entertainment value, it does happen. However, SuckerPunch has a unique feature in that it has no presumption of reality, and I believe this is by design. The very first images in the film were of a curtain rising on a stage featuring an obvious set that looks like Baby Doll's bedroom. And when the changeover occurs, our first few moments are spent on a theater stage as well. It's this purposeful disconnect from the presumption of reality that not only gives implicit support to switch gears the way the film does, but also allows room within the narrative to take the characters into the third space without having to explain not so much how it's happening, but why it's allowed to happen as presented. Even in a narrative fantasy film, you have to have some rules upon which the audience can base an understanding of how the fantasy world operates. Experimental films play with these ideas, but typically those types of films aren't used to tell stories the way more narrative-based works are. On the other hand, theater doesn't have the same relationship with its audience that film does because it doesn't have the same presumption of reality. Lighting changes create focus within the presentation that draws the audience into a metaphorical space within the performance. The characters often break the fourth wall for dramatic purposes, or there simply is no presumption that a fourth wall exists, and the structures used to create the sets are often visible, which damages any illusion of reality. Because theater lacks this presumption of reality, it's free to reconfigure itself to suit its own dramatic purposes, often on the fly and without warning. I believe this is why both the asylum and club sections open on a theater stage. It relaxes the presumption of reality and gives the film permission to make these kinds of dramatic changes to its storytelling. An examination of the club reveals that it's built of recontextualized elements from the asylum coupled to a visually heightened presentation. The head orderly becomes the club owner, the stepfather becomes a priest, as in Father So-and-so, the isolation room becomes a supply closet and punishment space, the dorms become the backstage, etc. It's here we get into the third storytelling layer, the world of dance. The idea of creating an altered state introducing the asylum as a therapeutic approach to self-empowerment is somewhat like reality therapy, which helps patients to focus on the present by setting and achieving realistically obtainable goals instead of dwelling on the past. As a storytelling device, Dr. Gorski uses music to accompany this altered state. The movie then takes this presentation and transforms it from a psychological concept into a more direct storytelling device. While it might seem like the music is providing a means of transport for the character, or at least acting as a trigger for her self-insertion into the fantasy, keep in mind that the primary changeover between the asylum and the club doesn't feature music as a trigger on the asylum side. However, there is music playing when we arrive at the club. This leads me to believe that the music itself is not part of a mechanism of transport, but a storytelling indicator used to let the audience know that a changeover has occurred and we've entered a new metaphorical space. The club is a metaphor for the asylum, and the combat scenes are a metaphor for what the women are trying to accomplish. In this analysis, the introduction of the idea in the asylum isn't as much to inspire the baby doll character to act, but to introduce the concept to the audience so that when it's implemented in the club, it doesn't seem like something pulled out of thin air. It's a rule set in the storytelling we can use to understand how the mechanic functions later on. What should be evident at this point is that the dance world is not a literal layer of reality that Baby Doll enters. Rather, it's a metaphorical representation of the character's internal fight, as Madame Gorski calls it. We can't make the case that the characters, or even Baby Doll alone, are being transported to a reality that features elements there is little chance they could imagine into being, as there is no storytelling to indicate they could imagine these things. Not only do the other women have no awareness of this happening, it's difficult to make the case that Baby Doll is even aware that the world has changed around her. All she seems to be aware of within the dance world is that she needs to get out. While what she needs to obtain to escape is metaphorically represented in the dance world, the ultimate goal is presented slightly differently. The goal, as clarified by the wise man, isn't to get out, but to be free, a very specific choice of words. The dance sequences themselves are built using elements that are coded even more deeply into the asylum world, so again, what we're seeing is a reconfiguration of the storytelling in line with the use of metaphor that substitutes fantasy combat in place of a young woman dancing sexually to represent her fight to be free. To reiterate, unlike the relationship between the club and dance worlds, which have very specific storytelling connecting them, no such relationship exists between the asylum and the club. There is no trigger mechanism or transcendental divide Baby Doll traverses to consciously move from the asylum to the club. At the point of changeover between those two spaces, we've already reached the end of a chain of events. The 5 days have passed, and we're in the middle of the lobotomy being performed. It isn't until after the procedure that we find out what happened in the club is in any way reflected in the asylum. asylum, so there is no presentation of a constructed reality being used to empower the character through those actions. And outside of one anomalous series of referential images used as Baby Doll explains her escape plan to the women, the club never directly references or relates to the asylum. If you believe that the club is just a mental projection, a wholly fictional space that Baby Doll has invented to escape the asylum, then nothing that happens in there has any weight. No one is in any real danger, no one actually dies, and nothing within it is vital. If nothing that happens in that world is real, then there's no reason to care about anyone's fate, feel anyone's loss, or revel in anyone's victory. If that world isn't real, then nothing that happens in it matters. And since the majority of the film's runtime is spent in the club, that's a whole lot of time for nothing that happens to matter. To round the storytelling back to Dr. Gorski in the asylum, the only time we can be assured that Baby Doll has made a conscious choice to enter any kind of altered state is just before the hammer strikes and her mind is gone. In the club, the High Roller offers Baby Doll a place where she can be free from all her concerns if she chooses to give herself to him. If we continue to look at the storytelling metaphorically, then the High Roller doesn't represent the doctor, despite being played by the same performer. He represents the needle. He is the device, not the hand that wields it. Dr. Gorski says, let the pain go. Let the hurt go. Let the guilt go. She also reminds us of Baby Doll's real trauma. Her mother died and she killed her sister. The reason she doesn't escape the asylum or the club is because escaping those places won't give her freedom from those traumas. They will follow her wherever she goes. But by choosing to embrace the High Roller's gilded cage, or the effect of the orbital class strike, Baby Doll is choosing to enter a place, another altered state, where those things will no longer affect her. She will, in fact, be free in the only place that truly matters, in her mind. It transforms the act from something being done to her into something she chooses. And it's the choice that matters. The choice is freedom. Efforts to criticize certain elements of the film have led to a number of critics presenting begging the question arguments that ironically should have led them back to reevaluating the storytelling. Primarily, the question of why a young woman in a position to create a world to empower herself and escape her circumstances would create a world over which she has no direct power and ultimately does not escape. Why not instead create one where she can save her sister, one where her mother doesn't die, or even one where her mother never marries her shitbag of a stepfather to begin with? There is no outside force setting up challenges for Baby Doll to overcome. The wise man isn't testing her or charting her progress, as he just announces what the goal is in each new dance. Nothing is coaxing her to grow an ability to shape the world like the heroes of Dark City or The Matrix, and she doesn't consciously manifest any control over the world anyway. This idea that the writers failed to answer the basic if this, then what questions of creation can only exist if one is inclined to believe those writers were simply incompetent. If that's not the case, then I believe the proper question should have been, if the storytelling isn't doing what I assume, then what is it doing? I'd like to say that the reason for the bad evaluations of the film are the result of the theatrical edit removing pieces of storytelling or the marketing that leaned heavily on the impression of the characters transporting between realities and presenting the asylum and club stories as if they were one and the same. However, even if the marketing was telling you the movie was a rom-com about a talking squirrel and a one-eyed pigeon, once you actually sat down to watch the film, those misconceptions should have fallen away. If a critic screening was preceded by a misleading explanation of what the movie was about, shouldn't the audience have caught on to that and made a note that what the movie was being sold as wasn't what the movie actually was? Some of the blame has to be laid at the feet of director Snyder if he chose not to address any notes or audience reactions that might have indicated confusion surrounding the mechanics of the storytelling. I'm not privy to the results of testing the film, but I find it difficult to accept that test audiences were able to follow the film in a way that critics and general release audiences were not. I had to take a big step back and come at the film with a very different perspective for this analysis, which meant watching it more times than anyone who didn't enjoy it the first time would ever want to subject themselves to. An artist only has a responsibility to themselves and their art, but a commercial artist has a responsibility to producing a product for consumption. So we would be within our rights to ask whether or not director Snyder would have been better off setting aside some of his artistic or intellectual sensibilities to make sure his storytelling points were absolutely clear to the largest audience. I'm not a big fan of the idea of dumbing things down, but I have to wonder if not wanting to compromise his vision of the film was really worth the outcome. It doesn't seem to have swayed him from the kinds of choices he makes as people continue to label his films as confusing despite any closer examination revealing very clear details supporting his storytelling. Even after clearing away the clutter, Sucker Punch isn't going to be a movie for everyone. While I do think a critical reevaluation of the material could only be of benefit, it's never going to overcome the gut impression some people have towards the material. We spend a lot of time as film fans yammering on amongst ourselves while trying to decipher and understand the movies we love. Sometimes we get so wrapped up in talking about the movies, we forget to make time to talk with the movies. Film is a conversation between the filmmaker and the audience, and it's really hard to have a conversation when one side is doing all the talking and none of the listening. Sucker Punch may or may not be a movie with a lot to say, but you'll never know that if you don't shut up about how the characters are dressed and allow the movie to actually speak for itself. This has been the Narrated, Not the Popular Opinion. As always, I have been Gray, and if you like what you heard, you can leave a tip at our Ko-Fi page at ko-fi.com/notthepopularopinion. You can follow us on Twitter at @only_Gray, and don't forget our main page at notthepopularopinion.wordpress.com, where you'll find more great articles just like this. Thanks again for listening, and remember, if you're as good to others as you are to yourself, we might just make it through this mess. See ya.